You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYSHAX.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how are you doing?
Great, thanks. Hello, all.
Still calling in from France?
Yes, my last week here in beautiful Chamonix in the mountains. Although you can't see the mountains today, it's all rainy.
All right. Well, awesome. Let's jump into it. We've got quite a lot to talk about today. Let's kick it off talking about the rates. What are the updates there?
The update is pretty much across the board continued weakness in rate levels that are continuing to decline, and most notably on the Pacific trades. This both goes for quoted spot rates if you're looking at some of the quoted spot rate indices. It also goes for the NYFI if you're looking at the actual paid spot rates. One thing I find very interesting that I think also U.S. exporters should start taking note of is the discrepancy we are now seeing between 20 and 40-foot rates. What I picked out here is the NYFI index, so this is cargo actually loaded, so we know these are spot rates being paid for actual cargo. Blue line being the price to move a 40-foot container, the orange one being the price to move a 20-foot. And what we should note is not the massive drop that we've already talked about, the temporary spike, but note how far especially the 20-foot rates have dropped. They have really had the bottom cut out under them the last couple of weeks. Normally, the 20-foot rate would be roughly around 80% of the 40-foot rate. As the market tightened, that actually got to about 100%, but now we're down to about 50%. And whereas 40-foot rates are now basically back to where we were before this temporary spike, 20-foot rates have dropped much further than where we came from. This is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, you can ask the question, why would the 20-foot rates into the US suddenly drop rapidly? First of all, let's be real, 20-footers are the containers you use if you have typically very heavy cargo. What would heavy cargo be? Well, that would be metallic products. That could be with a lot of steel, for example. And what has the U.S. done and is still in place? Significant tariffs on steel. So that could clearly be one of the elements why potentially demand inbound to U.S. on the Pacific there for 20-footers is faltering. But what's also important here is that the U.S. exporters should take note of this, because a lot of the U.S. export cargo, especially for a lot of the agricultural producers, they do prefer using 20-footers because a lot of that cargo is also heavy. If there's suddenly a collapse in inbound demand for 20-footers, that will change the equipment imbalance. So suddenly we will find ourselves over the coming weeks and months potentially in a situation where there's a lot fewer 20-foot empties available in the US than usual. This could lead to a situation where export 20-foot rates would potentially strengthen, and or you might find US ag exporters that are currently using 20-footers might have no choice but to use 40-foot containers. So a collapse in inbound 20-foot cargo could actually have a direct knock-on effect on U.S. ag exporters. They should at least follow up on this situation with their chosen carriers to make sure the equipment they need is actually flowing in as per usual.
Seeing the downstream effect of the imported 20-foot containers on how it affects the exports is kind of interesting, because you don't recognize it as being connected so intimately, but then you see the rates and how they change over time, and the patterns that come out of it. Safe to say that because the demand has been dropping, thanks in large part due to the tariffs, maybe we should shift into talking about the tariffs and what the latest updates are there.
Certainly. And I think, as we are recording this on Monday morning U.S. East Coast time, this is right after the announcement earlier today that there was a trade deal between the U.S. and EU. A couple of comments on that one, of course. First of all, it's an across-the-board 15% tariff. It is not stackable with other tariffs. That's the headline. If you look below the headline, there's a lot of similarities with some of the other trade deals the U.S. has announced, where it's heavy on the headlines, very thin on the ground in terms of details. The details that are or are not known presently is that the 50% tariff U.S. has on metals, notably on steel and aluminium, they still stand. So that's not 15, that's still 50%. There is clearly unclarity on what tariffs will be attributed to pharmaceuticals. The statements from the EU chief negotiator is that that's what it was called on a different sheet of paper, so no details there are actually known at present. And as far as I also know, wine and spirits is not included in this deal, and there are zero details right now as to how wine and spirits are going to be impacted from this deal. So this, to some degree, follow the patterns with some of the other trade deals we have seen announced over the past months, say the trade deals with we had them with Vietnam, we had them with Cambodia, we had them with Japan, we actually had them with UK as well. There's a lot of headline numbers, but the details are still sorely lacking. And for a lot of US importers, details actually do matter. What are the precise commodity codes that are or are not included? None of that is known presently.
Right. Politically, it might be, a big win that you've got this progress, but it matters to each importer who's in charge of specific products and product codes to know what's going on there.
Exactly, which is also why, if you are a U.S. importer, of course, okay, it is clarity that now it's 15%, and from August 1st, 15% is clearly better than the 30% that was threatened, or the 50% that was threatened just a few weeks ago. But given that this comes into force already on Friday, it would be nice to see the details in terms of specific commodity codes. And by the way, it would be nice to see this either in a specific executive order or filed in the Federal Trade Registry or something coming through Congress, something to actually make this legally binding. That is still also not signed and not in place. And bringing up Friday, Friday is August 1st. This is the deadline that we had for all the reciprocal tariffs. So for all the countries, and that is still the majority of countries out there, from August 1st, we revert back to either the reciprocal tariffs back from Liberation Day or to the tariffs that Trump was mentioning in the letters that he sent to, I think it was 15, 20 countries or so. The difficult part here, again, it's the U.S. importers that are going to have to shoulder the uncertainty here. The only executive order that is valid and in place is the one where the pause stops here on August 1st, reverting to the reciprocals that was known back from Liberation Day. The letters that were issued by Trump with different tariff levels have yet to make it into any kind of executive order. So apart from these being nice letters that Trump has signed and sent to the leaders of other countries, they still don't have any legal significance seen in the eyes of customs if you start to move cargo from August 1st and going forward. So August 1st, yes, it's a deadline, but exactly what it means is still very hard to nail down with surety for any importer.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot can still change between now and Friday. So Monday we might have some major updates here.
We might. And in terms of deadlines, that was when we had the podcast last week with Don. We were also noting that the deadline on August, 12th or 14th for China, that was also called into question by Scott Bessent at the time. So that's not necessarily a hard deadline. And the next deadline that becomes important is a couple of weeks ago, Trump was threatening 100% tariffs on Russia if there was not a peace deal. That in itself doesn't really matter that much. U.S. trade with Russia is relatively limited to begin with. But the important part of that threat was that Trump also threatened 100% tariff on any country that deals with Russia. The question is, what exactly does that sentence mean? Because if you are talking individual companies and countries, every country in the world to some degree deals with Russia. So what that threat means remains to be seen. 2 weeks ago, he gave a 50-day deadline. Earlier this morning, he said that he was going to shorten that deadline. We don't know what the date there is going to be, but that warrants close scrutiny as well. And it's just yet another element in this pile of uncertainty U.S. importers continue to face.
So even if we have some more solid numbers around what the tariff rates are by Friday, we still have this big question mark about how, if, when the additional tariff for anyone that, quote, deals with Russia, how it would impact the tariff rates that would come into effect.
Yeah, and you say whenever we have a tiny piece of information that seems to lend more clarity, we have 8 more pieces lending more uncertainty, unfortunately.
That does seem to be the case. Anything else to add about the tariffs and what we're seeing in the news there?
No, I think that the important thing is then to look at how is this going to impact trade flows over the next couple of months, especially the pivotal Trans-Pacific trade. Because what we have seen, and this is also why this peak was so short-lived and collapsed again, is very much a wait-and-see approach from a lot of the U.S. importers, given all this uncertainty. That's the rational response as well. The problem for a lot of U.S. importers is they're coming up against 2 other deadlines. One deadline is the holiday season. The holiday season is rolling around in Q4. You want to have your products on the shelves. So there's a limit as to how long you can do a wait and see until you actually start to move more product. The other hard deadline we're up against is Golden Week in China, the first week of October, where most of the factories shut down for vacation time. So those two deadlines basically mean for US importers that are playing wait and see if they are importing consumer goods that are important for the holiday season, these goods need to still be ordered, produced, and shipped no later than the end of September. And suddenly end of September is not that far away, especially if you're still playing the wait and see. If you're playing the wait and see and suddenly say, now I need to ramp up, you got to place the orders, you got to have the products or produced first, then you got to move it. So even if you start to ramp up now, that will then begin to mean a spike in demand, say late August. So we basically got a month left. And with the slump we've seen over the last month, there is a distinct likelihood that we're going to see another yo-yo, just like what we saw towards end May, early June. We go into a slump, and suddenly we have this massive spike as everybody tries to stampede at the same time. And then we get into early October and we get yet another collapse. So we got another one, potentially another one of these tsunami waves up and down coming.
Do we know, is there data out there that's showing that there are importers that want to be bringing in more material? Because I know, back earlier this year, I kept hearing about inventory levels being very high in warehouses, so they don't necessarily want to be importing more goods. They want to kind of get through that existing inventory. I don't know if you have any data on that, or if you could speak to that at all.
The problem with the inventory data is that is relatively lacked in terms of, the latest inventory data from the US that covers inventories in May. At that point in time, inventories held somewhat stable. So it's more down to what are you hearing from the importers. And again, this very brief spike we saw was also driven by a lot of importers rapidly saying, yes, we're going to import more. But once the reality of the situation, all the uncertainty hit them, they changed their minds rapidly, which is why we went back into this wait-and-see mode that we're in. To be honest, I think a lot of importers are also scratching their heads, trying to figure out how do you deal with this level of uncertainty.
Yeah, because I guess also part of the equation is, okay, we brought the goods in, now we have to sell them, we have to price them correctly.
Yes.
And if there's immense tariffs on it, it makes the cost of the good way higher. So then are people even going to buy it? So there's a lot of calculus, I imagine, going on.
There's a lot of calculus, and the problem is when you're ordering goods, you would like to know what is your landed cost. So you know what your shelf price is going to be. But the uncertainty on the tariffs on most countries right now means it's impossible to calculate your landed cost. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a lot of people might be between a rock and a hard place here, but we'll continue to monitor and provide updates as we hear them and talk through them more. Let's shift into talking about reliability. That's a nice buzzword in our industry, reliability. Could you explain what the latest numbers are and how it's calculated?
Yeah, certainly. We just saw the new report come out from Sea Intelligence noting around 67% on-time reliability, which is definitely an improvement compared to where we came from. Globally last year, we were hovering around 50%. At the worst of the pandemic, we were down around 30%. Historically, in the decade before the pandemic, this was typically between 70 and 80%. So we are approaching the historical norm, let's put it that way. But what does reliability mean? You can't measure everything. I think we had this chat a couple of weeks ago, maybe I had it with Dawn also. From a shipper perspective, it's basically down to, did I get my goods actually delivered on time? Now, when we're talking reliability, from a shipper perspective, did my cargo actually arrive on location as planned? But the problem in measuring that is it includes a lot of very, very different variables. One is,
right,
did the ship sail on time? Then another one is, did the feeder sail on time? Did it meet the cutoff for the main mother vessel? Did the truck run on time? Did I manage to gate my container out in time? What if the vessel is actually on time but it omits a port? So the vessel is on time and all the ports it does call, and then there's one port it doesn't call at all. So you got a lot of different nuances in there. So your mileage might vary, let's call it that way. But basically, the reliability being measured on the deep sea mother vessel is a proxy for the state of the whole industry. You will then have some shippers, especially if it's main port to main port, this is by and large what they experience. If you're using feeder vessels at one or both ends, you will likely experience a performance that is offset to this overall trend, likely in a downwards direction. So the reliability measurements that come out, they are true for some shippers, but for many shippers, it's more like a proxy measurement in terms of where you are. But by and large, reliability is better now than it was last year, but it's no means perfect, of course.
Are some carriers or alliances doing better than others?
Yes, let's take two of the key examples here. Gemini and MSC stand alone. Gemini is delivering the 90% plus that they were promising. It's then important to note that Gemini is promising this for their main hub to main hub services. And for a lot of shippers, they also need feeders. That comes on top. Gemini has not promised 90% if you also have feeder connectivity. MSC on their new standalone network, as far as I recall, they're at around 75%. Is that then worse than Gemini? Of course, the number is lower. On the other hand, MSC has more direct connectivity on some of the port pairs. So this again boils down to what are the exact port pairs you're shipping on. If you're shipping on the main hubs, you may find that Gemini has a better reliability. If you're shipping between some of the port pairs where MSC has a direct and Gemini has not, you might find that MSC has a better performance despite the overall average. I think the important part here is when we compare to the performance we saw both from Gemini, the Gemini partners, and from MSC, and by the way also from some of the other alliances, last year, all of them have improved their reliability, despite, for example, congestion problems in European ports.
That's good to hear, and the trend upward is also very positive. You want to see that the reliability gets back to the pre-pandemic levels, and
yes,
the service that you're paying for is better and it's on time. It's better for everyone.
I think on time is a stretch of the imagination given the state of affairs, but at least better.
Right, that's a fair point. All right. The last topic that we were going to talk about today is the Hutchinson port deal and the deadline that has passed. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our viewers here will remember back in early March when there was suddenly this surprise announcement that Hutchinson Port Group was going to sell all their non-Chinese terminals all around the world to a consortium consisting of BlackRock and MSC, and de facto this would make MSC the largest terminal operator in the world. But the deal was not completely done, and we are now at a point where there was a time limit where there was exclusivity in negotiating here between Hutchinson and BlackRock MSC. But, as I think we touched on a few times as well, it seems that this deal was made without the blessing of the party in Beijing. And they've been trying to put a spanner in the works, which apparently they have succeeded with. So at least according to the statement that came out, I believe, yesterday or this morning from Hutchinson, negotiations are now continuing, but they're continuing on the basis of bringing in a Chinese investor as well. Scuttlebutt has it that this is likely Costco we are talking about, but of course changes the nature of the deal. Whether this would then also include Chinese ownership party of the two terminals down in Panama remains to be seen. Let's not forget that this whole debacle started back when the Trump administration believed that the Panama Canal was controlled by the Chinese because of the position of the two Hutchinson terminals down there. Selling those terminals to BlackRock and MSC would solve the at least alleged problem of Chinese control, but bringing in suddenly Costco or Chinese player into this would also rekindle the whole Panama issue.
All right. Well, lots happening there. It's interesting that this is all kind of happening at the same time with the tariffs, but something else that I was curious about is the main incentive for Hutchinson ports to sell because of the, the rhetoric and the talks that were coming out of the U.S., or was there an underlying incentive there?
I would assume not, because if the underlying driver for Hutchinson would be the political issue between China and U.S., then surely Beijing would have been in on the early stages on this deal. The fact that the deal was announced and now Beijing is putting a spanner in the works certainly seems to imply that no, this was not done from a political aspect in terms of the issues between US and China.
Very curious. Well, we'll keep an eye on this and obviously report as we learn more. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up today's episode?
No, I think at least we've covered all the major uncertainties in the world. As usual, sorry we can't bring more clarity. The EU-US trade deal should bring a little bit more clarity, but again, at least as of right now, details are actually quite thin on the ground.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. We will be back here next week. But in the meantime, be sure to subscribe where you get your podcasts. We're on Apple Music, Spotify. We're also on YouTube. And until then, have a great week.
See you all.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by Nice Shacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.